Our scripture passage this morning is Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. So hear this good news. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called a crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous, sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." So there you have it. Let's see what we can do with this today. I've been seeing on Facebook from some of the people that I follow, and they have this big page on their post, "I am not ashamed of the gospel." I think to myself, well, okay. And then these questions come. Has someone been shaming you for it, or are you being persecuted for your belief? I mean, I would think that believing in Jesus and being good with the gospel in the United States is probably one of the safest places in the world where you can do that. So I wonder sometimes, why do people do that? I am not ashamed of the gospel. When I hear people say stuff like that, really after I get past the first initial response is, are they trying to convince me or are they trying to convince themselves? I mean, for me, it's kind of like a person who constantly goes around telling you how honest they are. You can trust me. I am honest. I promise you, you can trust me. And if a person has to say that out loud, often to many people, then my belief is this is not someone that you can trust. Because once again, are they trying to convince me, or somehow they're trying to convince themselves that they're the kind of human being that they want you to believe that they are? So, the gospel. What is the gospel? Well, it's literally good news. And my thinking is that if someone were to be ashamed of the gospel, or if they were embarrassed by it, then was it ever really theirs to begin with? You know what I'm saying? I mean, if I have a belief system that embarrasses me, then is it one that I've developed through my own life experience and journey, or is it something that I've accepted from others, and if I don't hold on to it, somehow I may be ostracized, right? And I can relate to that to a little. So sometimes I don't think, is it the gospel, Jesus' teachings that we're ashamed of or not ashamed of, or is it the religion wrapped around those belief systems? In the former tradition in which I lived, many years ago now, it would have fallen under the evangelical style of worship and theology. There were times that I was embarrassed to be called that religion because of the social stances it took, especially against women and against the LGBTQ community. I thought that, and even race, I thought that their social stances at times were just embarrassing, and I was embarrassed to be associated with them. So, is it that we're ashamed of the gospel, or maybe sometimes ashamed of the religion or the systems wrapped around that message and the way that they behave? Now, I remember when I was in my evangelical tradition, a big part of that was proselytizing, or going out and taking your stand, against whatever you were to be against at that time. And by sharing your social stance, using the Bible to proof text and support it, thus saying God also condoned it and makes you right, when they would start receiving social pushback from that, resistance, then that would be the time where we have to say, well, I am being persecuted for being a messenger of God. I am being persecuted for being a witness to Jesus Christ. Well, that's a little hyperbolic too. Persecuted means you get killed for things. But yeah, I can see that. So that's how we would switch that passage around, right? I am not ashamed of the gospel. I will stand true. But it really wasn't the gospel that we were standing up for, as much as the religious beliefs and the social norms and the moral beliefs that we held in that particular religion that often the world around us was not accepting, but rather rejecting. I remember very, very, very clearly, I was out of seminary for 5 years. And there was a fundamentalist Christian takeover of my former tradition. And we were in San Antonio, Texas, for the big convention, and this was the last chance for those who were more moderate and progressive in that denomination to keep the fundamentalists from having total control. And all the votes, everything passed like 1% to 2%, right? But against the moderates. And I remember when it was over and I was walking away from it, I remember saying to myself, oh my God, I can't believe this. I can't keep functioning in this denomination. What am I going to do? I'm just out of seminary for 5 years. I've just started my career. Now what am I going to do? And a voice popped in my head as clear as that ringtone bell, right, that's on your phone app. And this is the message that I received. I called you to be a minister, but not this specific denominational minister. The first time I considered that there were options. And about 4 or 5 years later, I became UCC. Being a part of that former denomination was a stumbling block for me, because I could not fully express who I was and be my truest self. I had to keep on guard. I had to hold back. I had to be careful about what I said and how I said it. So being a part of that religion was a stumbling block for me, and it was one that I removed myself from in 1992. So any religious group who does destructive things, who weaponizes Scripture, who weaponizes the stories that are about redemption and hope and connection with God, that weaponize them as a tool to beat people up with, to whip them into some kind of submission, to try to lower them or to separate them from the rest, that is a stumbling block for me. It's a total stumbling block for me. And I do not want to be associated with that type of group at all for any reason. I know that phrase, I am not ashamed of the gospel, that it's inspired by the text we have today where Jesus says, if you are ashamed of me, then I will be ashamed of you later on. But let's look at that in that passage. He doesn't say, if you are ashamed of my gospel, if you are ashamed of the religion that I'm creating, if you are ashamed of the movement that I'm creating, he says, if you are ashamed of me, if you're ashamed of what that meant in that tradition and in that culture, if you're ashamed of me, then you are ashamed of who I am, the very essence of my being. You are ashamed of my message of hope. You're ashamed of my message of healing for all people. You're ashamed of hospitality and making room at God's table for all people, whether they're Jewish or not, whether they're clean or not, whether they have sickness or not, whether they have mental illness or not, regardless. There's room at the table for all of God's children. If you're ashamed of that, if you're ashamed of the fact that I heal not only those of our own tribe, but also people outside of our tribe, if you're ashamed of the fact that I am finding ways to take the burden of the religious law off the shoulders of people and try to show them how they are engaged with and can become intimate with the divine without all the heaviness and the guilt and the shame that goes with it, then if you're ashamed of that, then yes, I probably am going to be ashamed of you, and there's probably not a lot of room for you in what I'm doing here. That's how I see that text. It's not ashamed of the gospel, it's ashamed of the person who he was. And when I see people who especially beat that drum and make the charge that I'm not ashamed, it's typically because they are being persecuted and finding resistance on social issues that they're claiming that Jesus is a part of and condones. My opinion, my experience. So yes, I am ashamed of people who use the name Christian. I'm ashamed of the people who use the word church to weaponize and beat people and do destructive and inhumane things to people. That is a source of shame. I do not want to be a part of their group. They don't want me there either. So what I've discovered is that so much that I call myself a Christian anymore, because that's a broad swipe, you know? If you're a Christian, then you must believe this. No, that's not who I am. Then I have to start describing what kind of Christian I am, which sounds foreign to a lot of people. But what I choose to call myself now is a follower of Jesus and his teachings. The whole thing with the church, too. It's the whole thing. When I describe the Windermere Union Church to people who have been kicked out of or not even allowed to participate in other churches or shamed for being who they are, you know, because this is what church does, they hear about us, they're not sure they believe me. And I tell them that this is not just unique to us, but it's a part of the United Church of Christ. And people say, oh my God, I didn't have any idea that there were churches like that out in the world. Okay, that's a good use of the word church. But typically what I say to people is I'm a leader of a faith community that has an incredible capacity to take the teachings of Jesus and apply them to their lives and to love one another in miraculous ways and to love the world around us. That works for me, and it's not a stumbling block for most people. I find that I get a much more active and listening audience to that than the other titles that we often have. So I am a follower of Jesus and his teachings. Now, last week, to make a little segue here, last week we talked about the word Satan, and I used this week's scripture passage as an example of that. And to give you just a little bit of background on this passage, because Mark does not do that. Jesus and his disciples were in Caesarea Philippi. And in that city, you were surrounded by the pantheon of all the Roman gods. And it was there that Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say I am? And they didn't really want to answer at first, but then they came up with, some say you're John the Baptist, return. Some people say that you're Elijah, return. Some say that you are the prophet. Then Jesus turns it around on them and he says, well, who do you say I am? And that's a point where everybody started looking at the dirt and looking at the sky and seeing a bird, being distracted, not making eye contact with Jesus at all because they did not want him to call on them. And then Simon Peter from the Greek word Petra, which means rock, blurted out, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Oh, I imagine Jesus was really relieved by this time because his passion is coming near, and he needed to know that they had gotten the message by now. Peter, he says, he prays, Peter, you did not come to this reality just through flesh and blood, in other words, with just your ego mind, but you came to this through the spirit that is within you, from your conscious mind, from your soul self, right? And then Jesus went on to teach them what is in the passage. And he said it very clearly and plainly. The Greek word there is like, it's just to the point. There's no hyperbole. There's no mysticism. This is exactly what's going to happen. I'm speaking to you plainly. This is what will happen to me. And Peter rebukes him. And the Greek word for rebuke in this context is not just disagreed with or Jesus, I think you should reconsider. No, it is in your face, wagging your head, shaking your finger, probably spittle coming out of your mouth because you're just trying to convince Jesus not to go through with this. Peter rebuked him. And what I found surprising in this, it seems like out of the character of Jesus, is that he rebuked Peter back and says, get behind me, Satan. Because Peter at that point had become a stumbling block for Jesus. Now, why is that? didn't really allow myself to ask why Peter was a stumbling block until many years later from when I first heard these stories. Why was that? It seems in my mind that at that moment in time, maybe Peter was starting to change his mind. Remember, Jesus was very clear of who he was, what his purpose was, and what he needed to do to fulfill it. And maybe in that moment in time, Peter was convincing him to compromise his purpose, his reason for being on this planet. And Jesus realizes at that moment the consequences of that, and he rebukes Peter back and says, Peter, you are not concerned about God things, but only things right here in your own little world. So Jesus, in that moment, that heated moment in that exchange, was able to help Peter, to help us to see that, yes, we can get caught up with what's going on in our own relationships and time and space and the here and now. And we can get so caught up emotionally in these things, but we're also a part of a greater plan. And Jesus' focus was still on that greater plan. He knew in order for him to fulfill what he came to this earth to do, that it went way beyond his relationship with his disciples. So, after the big rebuke with Peter, then Jesus starts a teaching lesson. And I want us to spend some time here today. So here's the lesson. He says, first, if you want to be my disciple, you must pick up your cross and follow me. You must bear your own cross. What does that mean? It means a very different thing to me today than what it meant to me 40 years ago. 40 years ago, the cross that we bear was promoting a religion that was not very popular, with a message that was offensive. And when people would strike back at us, then we would feel as martyrs. So we were bearing this cross of being the only true witnesses to Jesus and the only true disciples of God. Oh, what a cross to bear. That's not what I think it means at all. Here's the truth as I know it, with the Greek word gnosko, to know intimately. Here's the truth as I know it intimately. When we make a conscious choice to become our truest and most real selves, typically there's resistance to that. Typically. I won't say in all cases because I don't know, but typically there's resistance to that. Becoming your truest self. Stepping outside of the expectations that others have for you or life plans that others have for you. It's like for that person who's grown up in a family with an engineer and an accountant, two wonderful careers, and parents who are very analytical and left-brained, but you have an artist spirit, and you want to take a career in dance or music or visual arts, and you want to express yourself as an artist. That doesn't register with the accountant and the engineer necessarily, and by you doing that, there might be some conflict in your family. Or you can choose to compromise that and go to business school and become an accountant, or go to engineering, become an engineer, when it's against everything that you are as a human being. I can tell you from personal experience, I have a business degree, and that business degree included accounting 1 and accounting 2, managerial accounting, statistics, finance. That part of my brain is very small, and I am more of the artsy creative type, and I can tell you that going through those courses was torture for me. I learned something, I passed the test, I was able to use some of it later in life, but for the most part, I left it and it left me when I took the final exam. But that would be a case in point of a person wanting to become something that their parents don't even, in their wildest imagination, want to dream them to become. Then you add the color of your skin to that, or your sexual orientation to that, and then the cross you bear is much heavier. And those people who are LGBTQ, in most cases, their coming out stories are horrible, tragic, painful ones. And typically the people who are most abusive toward them are the people in their own family. And it's not so much at times that their family members don't want them to be this person, but their family members are embarrassed that they're this person. So they'll send them away to that therapy to train you how not to be gay. The individual who's gay may hope that maybe it works, because being gay in the United States is not an easy thing to do or to be. But you see, for the people in the LGBT community, the price of coming out and being their truest, honest selves is much greater than it was for me deciding to leave my former religious tradition. That cross was easy to carry compared to what they do, right? The simple fact of being who we are and being true to ourselves, having a clear vision of who I am and what my purpose in this world is, oftentimes will be the cross that we have to bear. Standing up for social justice. You may be a person who's compelled to stand up for social justice. When you see injustice being done, you show up, that you're there marching, you're the one breathing the tear gas, you're the one that's taking the chance of getting beaten and possibly even arrested for taking a stand for social justice. You see, you're doing this out of your own passion and your own need to create change in a society. And you're doing this and getting arrested, getting gassed, getting all these things is a part of the cross you bear for being your truest self. I don't think we need to go around creating reasons to have a cross to bear, because if we did, it probably would be inauthentic anyway. Those who rebuke us typically are the ones closest to us, like Peter was to Jesus, right? Typically family groups, typically our family or groups that we're a part of are the ones who rebuke us the hardest. And that's what makes it painful, you see. People I don't know, people who have no connection to my life don't like me. It does not hurt me. It does not bother me. I mean, I'm not trying to create that, but if that's the case, okay. But those whom I love and respect and I'm closest to, if they are rebuking me, if they are trying to make me something that I am not, then that's when it's very painful. Very painful. I remember when I was coming home from seminary back to Orlando and going to the church in which I belonged to at the time I was in school, and I started sharing the things I was learning in seminary, which I was very excited about. It made sense to me. I thought, oh my gosh, I need to share this with everybody. And people in my home church got so concerned that they sent a person that I had incredible respect for and love for to come and try to save me from what I was learning in seminary. And that's when I knew, as much as I love you, I'm going to have to start stepping away from you. You see? It's the way it happens. The stumbling blocks. Who and what are the stumbling blocks? And here's, for me, part of the bottom line. Whether we compromise ourselves in order to stay in relationship with people who don't like who we are and what we want to do and what we want to be, or if we compromise the relationships in order to become that person that we know who we are and need to be, compromise is still there. And it can be painful. And the cross that Jesus had to bear was staying true to himself, true to his message, and true to his purpose. And he was put to death for all three. See? Jesus knew what he was talking about. Then Jesus goes on into the passage and he says this, and this is where I really want to just spend a little time now. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever wants to lose their life for me will save it. All right, so first of all, let's take a look at the Greek word for life in this passage. Typically, what we see in the Gospels, the Greek word for life is zoe, which is like a way of life. It's a consciousness of life. It's a connectedness to this world and also to the divine. The other Greek word for life is bios, which means I am a carbon creature who lives on this planet along with everything else that lives on this planet, and therefore it's bios, biology, just a part of the study of life, right? But when I read this in the Greek, it was neither one of those words. The word for life in this passage is psyche, where we get our word psychology. Psyche. And the Greek word psyche means soul. So whoever tries to save their own soul will lose it, and whoever chooses to lose their soul for Jesus, in the end, will save it, right? It's the soul. It's what it comes down to. And the word whoever wants to save, the word want here is thelo. And thelo means will, an intention, a strong desire to do so, determined to fill a purpose, to do a thing because it brings delight and pleasure. So for those who want to save their life. Now, working with people in counseling situations, and especially those recovering from addiction, they will try everything in the world to save themselves before getting help. And it's not just true with just people with addiction, but all other kinds of disorders that they're dealing with. They will go to the bookstore, some of them, and buy every self-help book that you can get on it. But still, there comes a point where you need to have a person who is objective and who can help coach you and give you the tools to overcome so you can start in your recovery. So, but people who are bent to save themselves, even though they don't have the skills, the tools, or the resources to do so, ultimately will lose their lives. That's an extreme example, but that's the one that comes to my mind. And then when they do give in, when they do accept the recovery process, when they do start to recognize there's another way, then you see their life change, and you see them become more alive. The word here, save, the same word that I've been seeing throughout the gospel now for years, and this particular word is soze. Soz from the Greek word sozo. It means to become whole, to become complete, to become liberated. So when we give ourselves over to the teachings of Jesus or the teachings of the divine, and we become more conscious of our spiritual and our eternal self as it's connected with the divine as we function in this earth, that is where we find our peace. That is where we find our salvation, because we are becoming whole and complete people. It's about letting go. And I'm thinking of all kinds of wonderful examples about letting go. There's the Star Wars and young Luke Skywalker, as he's trying to learn how to embrace the Force and use the Force to help him to fight evil in the universe. Then toward the end, he's able to go with the flow of the Force to win. In the story of the Matrix, you have Neo, the main character, who is trying to learn how to get in the flow of the power and the things and the truths of the Matrix, which are different from what most people are experiencing. And once he's able to truly let go, he's able to fend off and fight all the evil that's going on around him. Letting go and going into the flow of life. My favorite group of painters were the Impressionists. And when they first started painting, their style was so outside of the accepted salon in France, and they could not get their paintings into the shows and things. And so they created their own society, the French Impressionists. And what was so different about it was, in the salon, it was studio painting. It was people painting, representational painting, but it was all done inside of a studio, whereas the Impressionists were not so much painting an object as they were how the light was falling on that object. So that's why the brushstrokes look quick and fast and maybe little dabs here and there, and that's why it's very thick, because light is constantly changing and bouncing off. But they were painting light. And they were poor, and no one was buying their paintings, but they stuck with it. They stayed true to their belief about this way of painting and creating art and painting light, that eventually their stuff started to sell, and they were able to be very well off. Saw another story that helps to share this point with you so profoundly, and you can see it right now on HBO, if you have HBO. And it's Black Artists, the Absence of Light. And part of the documentary is that we have an incredible African-American artists in this country. We don't know who they are because their paintings and their art don't show up in our galleries, in our shows, but they're making breakthroughs. And they featured one particular artist named Kara Walker, and her art was very different. And I heard one of her fellow artists describing her this way. When she first started doing what she did, people didn't get it. They criticized her harshly for it. They said it was no good. But she kept with it, and she stayed with her vision. And now she's celebrated and accepted all over. That's what I'm talking about. That's the burden she carried, the Impressionists carried. The burden that they carried in the beginning was the fact of being who they truly were and expressing themselves plainly. Even though they were receiving lots of pushback from it, they eventually, as they came into their own, the world around them started to accept them and to celebrate them. And this is what I think Jesus is talking about, saving one's psyche. If we compromise our psyche, if we compromise our soul in order to try to resist or to escape rebuke, or to stay in relationships with people that are very dear to us, but we compromise ourselves, then we are losing our soul. You're losing your psyche. And that to me makes a lot of sense. I'm losing my psyche, my soul, if I'm compromising who I am to try to please people who may not really have the bigger picture in their own minds. So, when it comes down to it, it's all about your psyche. It's all about your soul. Who are you? Who are you? Do you really know who you are? Who are you? And are you being that person? And are you being that person now? And if you're not, why? And what are the stumbling blocks? What are the stumbling blocks? What must you do to rebuke those blocks in your life, in your mind, in your heart, in your psyche, in your soul? Because it appears our psyche and our soul is life itself. Thus ends the lesson, and I'll see you next week. Peace.